I love Tuesday. It puts me in touch with the great Pulitzer Prize winner, multi-best-selling author. Now he is a professor at RIT, a place where smart kids go to be taught by even smarter professors. How about it for David K. Johnston?
Hello, Mark.
Hello, sir. Wow. I'll get to all the Trump stuff and the politics in a moment. I wanted to get to a question about Ukraine, because it does appear as though there's some serious changes in the way that war is coming down and how the entire conflict is now spilling into another area, with Russia actually being affected in ways they weren't early in the war.
Yeah, it's very interesting how the news in Gaza and other issues have just pushed Ukraine off the front pages and out of the network news. In the last week, the Ukrainians appear to have essentially destroyed an entire Russian airbase by sending drones that blew up its stores of munitions, magazines full of explosive material, sometimes called a munitions dump. Then they've done it again with serious damage. And President Zelensky is in New York right now because of the United Nations meeting, and he has apparently been pushing every American politician he can, every supporter, to get the Biden administration to further ease the handcuffs we've put on him. We've made it clear that we're going to give you these sophisticated weapons, but we're going to limit how far inside Russia you're going to use them, et cetera. And the new British government clearly is of the view that, we need to ease up these handcuffs, if not remove them altogether. But I think these successes, the Ukrainian military strategy is going to be studied and taught in war colleges 500 years from now. And I say that hoping there is no war in 500 years, but human history says to me probably there will be. But it will absolutely be studied. The tactics and the strategies that this country applied against a big aggressor with far more bodies to throw into the conflict. And one other thing, the Ukrainians are now benefiting from the fact that a number of the generals and colonels have been killed by the Ukrainians. The Russian army does not use sergeants, so they don't have the ability to make quick tactical decisions on the ground. Oh, we can't go this way, let's go that way. And now their army is largely conscripts and convicts. Those are not people motivated to fight, whereas the Ukrainians, despite their very heavy losses, are fighting for their freedom, for their country. And boy, if there's a lesson we should all remember from Vietnam, it's don't get messed in somebody else's property where they see their identity as being at stake. So I think these are very important developments. I'm not sure much will happen before the November 5 election, because Putin is hoping Donald Trump gets in, and that will be the end of our support for the Ukrainians. Donald Trump will just say to Putin, go take it. We'll help you. Would you like us to help you? That's even possible. He would try to do that. Whereas if Kamala Harris comes in, I think it's reasonable to conclude that they may not remove the handcuffs on Zelensky, but they will significantly ease up, and the other members of NATO will be much more willing to throw themselves into the fight, because they don't want to have what would follow from the loss of Ukraine, which is the invasion of Poland and the Baltic states. And as my relatives by marriage who are Hungarians believe, that Hungary and Slovakia will be in that list of places, because Putin has said he wants to put them back into the old Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in an aggressive way. It's funny, I was talking to the guy driving us from the airport. This is just 2 days ago, and we just got back from the East Coast, and he is Russian. And he said, I don't really speak super well. He said, my wife is actually very well-spoken in English, and my kids are very fluent. And we took them out of Russia because they wanted my son to go into the war with Ukraine. And so we fled, and that's how they ended up here. And I thought of you because you've spoken of this before, this conscript, this aggressive conscription policy they have in Russia.
Yeah, and we need to recognize that, first of all, the Russian government in writing promised that if Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that were based there before the fall of the Soviet Union, that it would never invade Ukraine. So there's a complete disrespect here of a norm that was established. Secondly, everything Putin has been doing is just simply extra legal. And the Russian military, way back to the czars, I mean, I've only read back about their military tactics to about the late 1700s, but they pay no attention to the rules of war. That's why you saw Putin's people deliberately, intentionally bombing daycare centers, hospitals, train stations, going after, in fact, in at least one case, a home for the elderly, going after people who are not military targets. And we need to, if we don't stand up to that kind of aggression, it will just continue. There's no negotiating with Vladimir Putin. He needs to face utter humiliation. And there is some indications, not a lot, but some, that a number of the leadership class in Russia, many of whom are his criminal friends, are deeply concerned about what's happening. And part of that, I believe, is because for the first time in history, really significant and effective sanctions, economic sanctions, have been applied. They haven't completely shut down the Russian economy, but they've severely damaged the Russian economy. The Russians are basically out of foreign currency now. They're making trades, barter deals for things. It's no way to run things on a country level.
Do you see the end game? You kind of note it in what you've just said when you were talking about, total humiliation and total defeat, I guess. But do you see the end game coming in some kind of timetable that is manageable? It already seems as though this has gone on for so long, and I don't know that that you'll get that moment of defeat that you've talked about, like from Putin, where he'll really concede defeat. That's certainly something he wouldn't want to do.
Well, so let's go back to how, what started here in the beginning, almost 2 years ago, 21 months ago or so. Putin thought he would just roll in to Ukraine and take over. And this was seen coming for a long time. If you were paying attention, the Ukrainians certainly knew for 6 months or more that this was in the cards. And they have proven to be a much tougher foe than Vladimir Putin ever imagined. But Putin is on record all over the place, in his own writings, in his speeches, in the staged interviews he does with state media, that the worst thing that happened in the 20th century was the collapse of the old Soviet Union. He intends to put it back together. And well, the evidence suggests at the moment that he probably wouldn't be very effective at that because he doesn't have a very good army. He has a Potemkin army. That doesn't mean that he's not going to do everything he can, if he can succeed in Ukraine, to press on. He's not a democratically elected person. Yeah, he was elected in a totally staged vote. And people who live behind what was the Iron Curtain, people I know, both family through marriage and journalists I know and academics and other people I know, just people randomly that I know, they are all very, very concerned that if the NATO, with its support, but not soldiers, not sailors, not airfare, but with aircraft, but with financial support, primarily in terms of providing weapons and electronics that allow you to track the movements of the Russian army and disrupt their activities, that if we don't do that, other Russians are going to come along after Putin, and they're going to seek to restore this. So I don't see at this point any way to end this on a permanent basis with less than the utter humiliation of Putin, to the point where he loses his grip as the modern czar, the dictator in Russia.
Wow. Wow. That may be a tall order for a while then,
Yeah.
because of, well, and so to this election season, we're so close to. In fact, there's already voting going on, as you know, in several states.
Right.
And Donald Trump, someone who you know very, very well. You know him from a style standpoint, the way he thinks, from a tactical standpoint, the strategies he employs. He said, of course, that this Ukraine thing never would have happened if he had been president. And then he pivots from that to Gaza. Gaza never would have happened. He is the strongman of the world, and no one would dare upset the apple cart if he were president.
Yeah, there are lots of fantasies out there, and then there are just outright delusions. I mean, Donald always claims these magical powers. When he says he doesn't even have to be president, he can stop the war in Ukraine. Well, stop it then. Sorry, go ahead, stop it. That's just not how the world works. And
he does have that thing, David, where he goes, if you just let me do it, I can have the whole thing over before lunch. Whatever the thing is, he has and yet people.
What he has are concepts of a plan to do something.
Thank you.
That he doesn't know anything about. The issue here, let's be very clear. This is not, the war in Ukraine is not a war about money. It's not a war about getting oil fields. This is a war about liberty. This is a war about freedom. Are the Ukrainians going to be a free people, or are they going to be under the boot of the Kremlin again? Back when the old Soviet era, when the language was the Ukraine, meaning a district of the Kremlin's jurisdiction. And when you have a war over liberty and there's a clear aggressor who has no reason to do what he did, both in sending his little green men with no insignias into Crimea in 2014, and then saying, I know nothing about this. I have nothing to do with it. Very Donald Trumpian, by the way. I don't know anything about it. And then, of course, as soon as he had control of Crimea, he said, well, of course, those were my soldiers. At its core, that's what we need to recognize, that this is about liberty. Someone's posted in the group, it's a civil war. No, this isn't really a civil war. This is a war of aggression by the Kremlin and the desire to take back. And they thought the easiest target would be Ukraine. I mean, after all, the president of Ukraine is a comedian. I think what Putin didn't appreciate is every comedian who's successful, at least that I've ever met, is incredibly smart. You got to be really smart to be successful at high-level comedy.
The left, it's interesting to me, the far left and the right now, in the face of maybe a Tulsi Gabbard might be a good example, because she's dining out, of course, on sort of a peace platform, as she is a surrogate for Donald Trump.
Right.
They say, they had a president, the Americans undermined that presidency and yanked Ukraine back into sort of NATO scoring position, and Russia was afraid of that. And in essence, then, we in the West provoked this entire conflict. Can you speak to that?
Well, that's the argument that the Kremlin wants to sell. And I was interviewed yesterday by a student journalist who asked me about what I saw as the biggest geopolitical problem in the world, in America. In America. And I said, I think that Americans don't appreciate the depth to which foreign governments are interfering with and undermining our election. It's not just Russia. And I'm somebody who has literally exposed spies and foreign agents going back more than a half century. I saw it in Michigan. I saw it in Sacramento. I saw it in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And understandably, foreign governments want to interfere with us, just as we have interfered in many other governments around the world. That's sort of the geopolitical chess game at one level. But ordinary Americans really need to understand that a lot of the things they're hearing come out of the mouth of somebody like Ms. Gabbard, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have literally spoken what amount to talking points from the Kremlin that you can take from RT, the Russian state propaganda channel, and other sources, and they don't seem to feel apologetic about that. I mean, there was a time when if you spoke a Kremlin talking point in this country, I'm talking about the late 40s and the 50s during the Great Scare, or the Great Fear, why you would be blacklisted, you'd lose your job, horrible things would happen to you. And now we have a party, the Trumpublicans, who embrace Kremlin propaganda. And they embrace the idea that liberty is not worth defending. And much as I dislike war, I wish we could get to where the movement from, 40 years ago called Beyond War wanted to take us. I don't see it happening in the lifetimes of my, now I guess I can say, great-grandchildren.
Well, it's a remarkable thing. You're talking about something and a trend with the GOP that is quite extraordinary. I mean, the coin of the realm for the GOP for so long was that anti-communist, as you say, I mean, a really anti-Eastern Bloc posture. And then somehow, and I think it even predated Trump, but certainly now it's had new life breathed into it. The way we've sidled up to, at least the GOP has sidled up to Russia. As we look at polling, David, I was talking about this in the first half hour. It's amazing that the Trump fear-mongering and his warnings to agricultural concerns in Pennsylvania, where he's spending a lot of time, rural communities, that you'll lose your farms, the immigrants who are coming here are going to essentially be a burden on the economy, and as a result, there'll be bankruptcies everywhere. None of you will have the kind of livelihood that you have now, and it will only get worse. I mean, this is what he's serving up, and there seems to be some traction for that message.
Yes, I think Americans don't pay, as a class, a lot of attention to government and particularly foreign relations. We just don't. Only about 1 in 6 Americans has a passport. And unless you have one of these new enhanced driver's licenses, you can't go to Canada or Mexico without a passport. Whereas everybody in Europe, I mean, virtually 100% of Western Europeans anyway, have passports. And they can travel within the Schengen district, that's most of Europe, freely. But they all have passports so they can go beyond that, whether they do or not. And so I think in a lot of ways, we don't have a political and social culture that pays a lot of attention. Now, on the polling issues here, I continue to be very, very skeptical of the polls. When I was doing polling to make extra money when I was in my teens and 20s, you would get, 1 in 3 people about to answer the questions. And now you're getting less than 1 in 100, in some cases 1 in 200. And so the pollsters use very sophisticated statistical tools to weight the responses they get. You want to have a random sample of Americans. If you got 1,504, there's a mathematical reason. If it's a true random sample, it'll give you a good feel for what's going on. But the fact that so many people won't answer the questions suggests that the self-selection process is misleading us. And that you see a series of polls that indicate things are going this way, and suddenly there's a new poll that has quite different numbers. That should be a good indication of a big change. The vast majority of Americans made up their minds some time ago about who they were going to vote for in this election. And the number who are undecided, the one thing we know about people who are undecided is that by and large, they are what are politely called low information voters. People who don't know what they're talking about or what they're hearing. And a good example of that is the piece I wrote last Friday. It led the New Republic on Friday it was just an explainer of how tariffs do something that no one else had written about, to my shock. Donald Trump announced, he's going to impose a 60% tariff on Chinese goods. Presidents can do that without further action by Congress because Congress has given the president the power to do that. So if that happened and you wanted to buy a Chinese car that costs $10,000 today, you'd have to pay $16,000. Well, that sounds like a pretty good thing to say that people won't buy Chinese cars, except imagine, Mark, that you own a car company. You own Mark Thompson Cars, and you sell them for $10,000, and you get $1,000 profit each time you sell a car. You're not going to keep trying to sell them for $10,000. You're going to raise your price to just under $16,000. So to make the math simple, let's say you raise it to $15,000. Well, that means your profit's going to go from $1,000 a car to $6,000 a car. And you're going to get fabulously rich, even if you only sell half as many cars. Because one of the things tariffs do, one of the reasons you want to have tariffs if you're an underdeveloped country, why we use them in the beginning of the American experience to build up our domestic industries, is they allow bigger profits to the domestic makers while they figure out how to become efficient and compete with the makers of, say, stoves that were imported from England or the Netherlands or Germany. And even Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who I did a little bit to teach when he became a columnist how to do journalism, it didn't write or say anything about this other effect. A tariff on Chinese goods, which are also made in America, is an increase in the price of American goods to 95% of the additional cost of the tariff.
There is that piece.
Tony, I didn't see Kamala Harris trying to explain it, and it's not that difficult to explain.
It's funny. It would take 30 seconds to explain it. We mentioned that last week. By the way, there'll be a link to that David K. Johnston piece in the New Republic under this show, and also under the video breakout of David K. Johnston, if you're wanting to
and Mark, I'll tell you that from the emails and letters that I got from people, most Americans do not understand that a tariff allows domestic manufacturers to raise their prices. They do not understand that. I also got an email from someone who said I was obviously a paid agent of the Beijing government for writing this, because there are all sorts of other issues I didn't go into, like subsidies from the Chinese government to their manufacturers. Not like we, of course, don't have subsidies for ours. But that kind of response is indicative of how we've gotten away from legitimate, robust, vigorous debate in favor of it's my way or it's a lie. And that very bad for democracy. We should have vigorous debates.
The latest from Trump is that he's saying, in relation to tariffs, he'll put a 100% tariff on every car coming into the United States across the Mexican border if he wins the election. Quote, "We will put a 100% tariff on every single car coming across the Mexican border. The only way they'll get rid of that tariff is if they want to build a plant right here in the United States with you people operating that plant." He was obviously talking to auto workers, and he's again, this is at his rallies in these critical swing states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Yeah, so that speaks to what you're talking about. He is hitting the tariff thing hard, and nobody's calling him out on it. And it doesn't take long to call him out on it, but no one's doing it.
A tariff is a form of tax, and it is effectively a national sales tax. And sales taxes are inherently regressive for a very simple reason. If you make $60,000 a year, you're spending almost every dollar you make, and maybe every dollar you make, just to get by. If you make $6 million a year, you're probably only spending a tenth of that, and you're reinvesting and saving the rest of it. Or you're buying assets that will grow in value over time. You're investing your money in other ways. And I don't think a lot of people understand and appreciate that the national sales tax effect of a tariff is to essentially take money out of your pocket and put it in the pockets of domestic manufacturers.
Well, I mean, this is just today, David. Trump telling supporters in Georgia that he would take manufacturing jobs and factories from other countries if elected. He was talking about economic policy. This will get a lot of play later today in the evening news, et cetera. He said he would do this again. He would get these manufacturing jobs and factories from other countries and get them over here. He would do this by lowering corporate taxes, slashing regulations, and granting, quote, free access to American markets for companies that made products in America. Again,
I mean, think how nonsensical that is. American companies already have free access to the American market. I mean, it's just, something we've perhaps forgotten. Donald Trump started this trade war with China. The Chinese then stopped buying American soybeans, corn, and it's the two things they principally buy are soybeans first and foremost, and then some corn. Who benefited from this? Well, Brazilian soybean farmers who now ship their soybeans to China. They ship them, by the way, on very large amount of them on ships owned by the family of Elaine Chao, Mrs. Mitch McConnell, who was transportation secretary under Trump and who was recommended for criminal prosecution. I wrote about her in my last third book in my Trump trilogy. She clearly was using her office to curry favor with the communist Chinese regime on behalf of her father's business. And we are paying as taxpayers billions of dollars. The last time I looked, it was $28 billion a year in subsidies to Midwest soybean and other farmers to make up for the sales that we used to make to China, but are now going to Brazil, with the Brazilians selling the crops. So I'm sorry, if you want to lose American markets and then pay American manufacturers or farmers to make up for that, then I think you ought to vote for Donald Trump, because that's what you're going to get.
In our last minute, I want you just to respond to a couple of things. Randy says, is Trump under-polling like in 2016? In other words, is there more support for Trump, maybe in your view, than people are willing to admit in polling?
Yeah, I mean, because I don't trust the polling here, we don't know. But if you look at the crowds who have turned out and you look at the donations and the number of people who've registered to vote and the results in I guess there are 10 jurisdictions now where there's been some kind of a vote on matters related to women controlling their own bodies, their reproductive health. All of that augurs very badly for Donald Trump. He says, I hate Taylor Swift. What a strange thing to do. But, apparently as soon as she said, I'm endorsing Kamala Harris, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people registered to vote. That's an enormous number. And what I would think is most significant here is less polling than the really determined and serious efforts by Republicans to block people from voting. I don't know how more un-American you can get than trying to prevent people from voting. But there's been, 500,000 people removed from the voter rolls in Texas. They've sent law enforcement to the homes of some people working on voter registration to try and scare them. In Georgia, in Florida, and a couple of other states, there have been hundreds of thousands of people taken off the rolls. So one thing listeners ought to do, and you've clearly got an audience all the way across the country. In fact, when I spoke at an international conference in Toronto over the weekend, I met people who watch you who are in Canada.
Oh, that's great. Great to hear.
The one of the things that people should do is go see if your voter registration is current. Now, if you live like where I do in Western New York, we don't have problems with dishonest, corrupt, politically inappropriate manipulation of the voter rolls, but that's not the norm in a lot of places. So go check, see if you're actually registered to vote. If you aren't, on election day, you can insist on getting what's called a provisional ballot. You get to vote, they put it in a separate envelope, and then election authorities and sometimes judges get involved, will decide whether your vote gets counted.
Feels like we're going to have judges involved in the settling of this outcome. But I want to ask you, I promise you this is the very last question about
no
Georgia,
problem.
because you made this point, and I think it's so pertinent and relevant about these last-minute rule changes and last-minute changes to basic voting in so many states. the Georgia hand count that they have now insisted on, if you really read it, it's more than just one hand count. There have to be simultaneous counts. There have to be duplicate counts. They make the count go several times, and it has to come up the same. Otherwise, they have to start all over again. And the last thing I'll just say, and then I'll let you speak, is machine counts are so much more accurate. I can understand why you might want a hand count to check a machine count, maybe in addition to, but machine counts are insanely accurate. That's why they're the default mechanism for banks.
Right. Normally, we use a machine count, and then if there's an issue, we can hand count. This will require meticulous care in counting the ballots. It's going to delay knowing the results, in all likelihood, in Georgia for some time. And of course, Donald Trump's view is if it's after, he's ahead at 12:30 in the morning, then therefore it had to be dishonest. Somehow this was corruptly done. I don't have a problem with paper ballots as long as we as taxpayers spend enough money to accurately count the ballots. And that requires training people in how to do it, because there are little subtle issues that arise. We saw that with the Chads in 2000, and people mismarking their ballots. You're told fill in the circle, and people put an X in it sometimes, things like that. They don't follow directions. Before I go, one thing, Mark, somebody in the chat said, we don't manufacture squat in America. Absolutely wrong. There's been a huge increase in the number of manufacturing workers in this country since Joe Biden became president. We are on a tear when it comes to manufacturing. We are building new factories, a lot of them with government subsidies for sure. We are hiring workers in factories. Many of these are high tech. I don't mean computer, I mean sophisticated factories. And this has been one of the big growth areas in the American economy. It's the reason that out of the 20 leading economies in the world, the rest of them are treading water or sliding downward, and the U.S. is surging ahead, way ahead of everybody else. Manufacturing is just doing gangbusters in our country right now, and don't believe anybody who tells you the opposite. And if you don't believe me, the data is all published. Go do a Google search. How many manufacturing jobs by month? In America. What's the value of manufactured goods? What's the value of American exports and imports? All of this stuff is gathered. It is relied on by business. Businesses have a big stake in the U.S. government accurately, as best it can, gathering all this data. We employ thousands of people on pricing and other issues that give us economic statistics. And indeed, one of the reasons we won World War II in 4.5 years instead of the 13 years predicted by military planners in 1939 was it turned out we had vastly more manufacturing capacity and know-how than anybody in Washington realized in 1939.
Wow. Well, check out his latest piece. There's a link to it under this video and under the breakout video. David, of course, I love our time with you, and we look forward to next Tuesday. Thanks, pal.
See you next week.
All right, David K. Johnston, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.